It is my great pleasure to introduce Srishti Nayak. Srishti, you can show yourself. Hello, great to see you. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Wonderful. It's an exciting conference. It has been an exciting conference so far, and we are super happy to welcome you here. For those of you who don't know Srishti, she is a postdoctoral fellow at the Music Cognition Lab at Vanderbilt. And you are most of the time working on the relationships between speech rhythm, musical rhythm, and language development. So you're doing a lot of work with preschool and school children. And you have this wonderful preprint that I've seen on SciArchive, and I guess that we'll hear much more about this now. The title of your talk is The Shared Biology of Musicality and Language. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Just going to share my slides. All right, so thank you for that introduction. As Daniela said, I'm a research fellow at VUMC in Nashville, USA. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm actually trained as a cognitive neuroscientist and developmental psychologist, and now I'm working with Rena Gordon and learning a lot about how to investigate the genetics of some of the human complex traits I'm already interested in, like musicality and language. So before I get into my talk, I just want to say that everything I'm going to say today is the result of some really exciting team science. My collaborators on the paper that Daniela just referred to, which is called the MAPLE framework, which I'll get into a lot today. All of that is a result of working with people who are trained in genetics, in cognitive neuroscience, in language, in different kinds of biological backgrounds. So that's really exciting. So we know from previous work from our colleagues that when you look at individuals with common language disorders like stuttering, dyslexia, and developmental language disorder, there seems to be an overrepresentation of atypical rhythm abilities, usually in terms of impairment or deficits. And so this paper that my colleagues published in 2020 is a really comprehensive review of all of these studies that show this result. And in this paper, where they posited the atypical rhythm risk hypothesis, kind of saying that atypical rhythm sets you up for risk for developmental language disorders, and they posited that the main contributing factors could be thought of as, of course, home environment and brain factors, but also the role of genetic factors, specifically genetic pleiotropy or shared genetic architecture between musicality and language. And so the work that I'm talking about today kind of extends this idea and looks at, instead of just looking at atypical abilities and rhythm, I'm looking at individual differences across the spectrum in various kinds of musical abilities. So we sort of already knew that there were a handful of studies, or actually more than a handful, that were beginning to show that the individual differences in musical abilities are associated with individual differences across the spectrum in language abilities. So this is where we started our deep dive. So here I'm showing you a very large table that's in our paper that I've broken up into 3 parts to fit on the slide. And I want to draw your attention here, where we looked at musical rhythm related traits and whether they, and looked at the studies that reported positive correlations between rhythm traits and either speech, reading, or grammar skills in language. And I'll get into why, those 3 in a moment. And then also looking at tonal melodic skills and how they relate to speech, reading, and grammar. So we found, we looked at many studies, over 70 studies, but we found 50 that made a clear sort of, that showed clear evidence of this positive correlation that we were thinking about. And so this deep dive that we did in the literature especially focused on the literature on individual differences, where people were moving beyond looking at differences, let's say, between musicians and non-musicians, or before and after a music intervention, but really looking at, just typical abilities in music and language and how they relate. So this kind of motivated us to think about the need for a framework to systematically explain these findings. And also frameworks can be really helpful to guide future investigations and to make testable predictions about what else we're going to find related to these findings. Another thing that we noticed when we were reading the literature was that although all of these studies and all of these analyses that I mentioned were correlational designs, in the sort of speculations and discussions of the findings, there were a lot of studies that sort of defaulted to neuroplasticity-based explanations, which obviously probably has a big role to play. But essentially, what I want to point out here on the right is that the current designs can't actually rule out the shared genetics between musicality and language, or musical abilities and language abilities. So while neuroplasticity probably has a role to play in the sense that perhaps your environmental background with musicality or can shape your brain in a certain way that sets you up for certain support systems for language, we can't really rule out the shared genetics. And we already know from human genetics that distinct complex traits that consistently show high phenotypic correlations, or in this case, behavioral correlations in the literature, are likely influenced by a common set of genetic influences. So this was kind of the crux of where we were going with this framework. And in the process, we also wanted to do a little mini review of all of the behavioral genetics studies, which are essentially like different forms of twin and family studies that already show that musicality, various aspects of musicality, including environmental aspects like how much people practice music, have a pretty significant genetic component. So here, just on the table on the left, I'm just showing you a snapshot of what we found across many behavioral genetic studies. The numbers essentially denote the heritability. So the studies that found that rhythm perception has a 0.5 heritability, it essentially means the proportion of variance in rhythm perception could be explained by genetic factors to that extent. So 50% of the variability could be explained by genetic factors. And in the case of rhythm production, let's say 34%. And similarly, we found, we did this mini review of the heritability of speech and language traits. So this is sort of further, building up kind of the synthesis and the evidence to say that, let's really look at the shared genetics hypothesis as a complement to neuroplasticity explanations. And so our framework is called the Musical Abilities Pleiotropy Language and Environment Framework. And again, pleiotropy is essentially the genetic overlap. So as you can see on the left, we call it the MAPLE framework. And on the left, the sort of main idea is the genetic pleiotropy between all of the thousands of genes that influence musicality, since it's a complex trait, and all of the thousands of genes that may influence language-related genes. We expect some kind of overlap in the genetic architecture of those two things. And then when we say that there are shared genetic influences, so I'm going to take you from the left side of the framework to all the way to the right side, we are sort of positing that is what leads to the phenotypic correlations that we see in the literature, right? So all of the associations that we found with musical rhythm, tonal melodic skills, and speech, reading, and grammar. But since it is genetic influences, it still needs a biological medium through which to exert its effect. So of course, we posit that the brain is a big part of that, but alongside the brain, we also want to think about and test hypotheses about the other kinds of nervous system development, structure, and function playing a role in that mediator. So we're thinking of these as neural endophenotypes, or sort of the mechanisms of how the genes are influencing the phenotypes. And that includes things like sensory motor coordination and auditory processing and the biology of audition as well. Now, just to say quickly that, of course, like I said, I am a developmental psychologist by training, and I'm always thinking about gene-environment interactions as well. So this framework really makes room for multiple types of gene-environment interactions, in the sense that, it captures some of the hypotheses that we would have intuitively about neuroplasticity, where your home environment can, of course, shape your your nervous system development, structure, and function in certain ways. But we also want to sort of highlight that there is a role for genetic influences on the environment as well. Like I showed you in the previous slides, even musicality traits like how much you practice music have a genetic component. And so there are multiple sort of mechanisms through which all of these different factors play out. And the exciting part of this framework is that it gives us something really concrete to test directly using genetic methods, as well as neuroscience methods. So I'll get into that a little bit more. So like I said, the first thing we did was sort of do a deep dive into the literature showing the phenotypic correlations, right, which is that right side of the framework. And we found, over 50 studies that showed the relationships, and we wanted to synthesize the patterns of associations that we were finding. And we also took a look at studies that reported specific neural correlates of the associations that were found. And again, just a reminder, we looked at rhythmic and tonal melodic skills for musical abilities and speech perception, reading, and grammar. So I put these three little icons on the right so that when you see these, on my future slides, you kind of recognize what's going on. So the first icon is referring to musicality variables or musical ability variables. And the second one is referring to speech language variables. The brain is referring to all the neural variables. So I'm just going to take you through sort of some of the literature synthesis. So let's start with speech perception. And like I said, we had reasons to pick speech, reading, and grammar. So speech is really fundamental to spoken language acquisition and successful communication, as you can imagine, especially being able to perceive speech. And perceiving speech is actually a set of complex processes, right? So you have to segment speech streams, you have to understand context and emotions in people's speech. You also have to be able to listen and understand, listen to and understand speech in non-ideal conditions. So when you have many speakers in a room and you're trying to sort of focus on one person or other types of noisy conditions. And we already know that speech perception impairments or deficits or difficulties are associated with speech language and reading disorders, which is kind of a fascinating link in itself. And we also have some evidence that speech perception may be particularly relevant in the context of music because musicians have been known to be more perceptually and neurally sensitive to speech perception. So we found, we synthesized and found 17 studies that looked at or that reported a positive correlation between musical abilities and speech perception abilities. And the constructs really kind of they were a diverse set of constructs, but all the results were sort of converging. So some people looked at speech rhythm sensitivity, which is more a prosodic perception kind of thing. Some people looked at speech perception and noise. There were studies on speech discrimination, pitch perception, and neural encoding of speech. And in total, the 17 studies represented the entire age group of 19 to 60 years of age. So a wide sort of age group represented there. And so just to give you a few examples, these are some figures from studies that reported positive correlation between speech perception and noise and some element of rhythmic skill. And so on the left, the slope is going downwards, but that's because it's a speech reception threshold. So the lower the threshold, the better it is. And it sort of correlates with beat discrimination and rhythm discrimination skills. Similarly, in the other figure, you have this relationship between speech and noise and drumming to a sequence. And then another study showed, again, a positive correlation between lexical stress perception. So that's the stress patterns within a word and rhythmic skills. And then we have this neural study. Again, here, the x-axis is neural noise. So the less the noise, the better. And showed that neural noise was correlated with musical aptitude, musical perception skills overall. So that's just an example. We have many more studies in the paper, but I just want to take you through to get a sense. So the other construct that we looked at was reading and reading readiness. And in the US context, almost 2/3 of 12th graders, according to a recent report in 2016, do not have the skills required for mastering college level reading material. So we know that reading is a really important thing to study in general. And up to 22% of adults have below basic literacy. And obviously, depending on the country you're in, there are different statistics for this. And we also know there is sort of compelling evidence that literacy is really important to sort of social and economic outcomes, and has been associated with wages and employment opportunities, as well as health risks. And a lot of reading readiness skills, which is skills that children need before they can read successfully, such as decoding print to sound, being able to reading fluency, which sort of continues once you learn how to read, as well as phonological awareness, which is learning how to combine and use sounds in your specific language. A lot of these also then support reading development and comprehension. So these are sort of many of the reasons we're interested in reading when we think about musicality and language. So here we actually found the most number of studies in this particular link, musical abilities and reading. We found 29 studies. A lot of these studies were in children, because that's sort of where a lot of the research efforts are when it comes to reading readiness and reading. But there were some studies in adults. And so the age group represented was 3 to 40 years. And again, there were many different constructs, but the converging evidence was pretty compelling across orthographic sensitivity, neural sensitivity to print, reading fluency, as well as phonological awareness, which is an important reading-related skill. So here the study shows tonal melodic skills were correlated with a sort of composite variable of various linguistic measures, which most strongly load onto reading skills. So this is kind of a correlation between tonal melodic skills and reading. We also found that in beat synchronization skills, this study shows that beat synchronization skills at their time 1, which was at age 4, predicted letter name knowledge, which is orthographic sensitivity, at age 5. So there's this little bit of a longitudinal connection. And then we also looked at this interesting study that showed that rhythm discrimination is related to reading development, but also they partialed out sort of the mediating effect of phonological awareness and showed that, yes, phonological awareness is strongly related to rhythm discrimination and reading development, but rhythm discrimination has a sort of direct effect on reading development as well through this mediation analysis. And lastly, I'm going to take you through the grammatical, why we got interested in grammar. So we know that morphosyntax skills are foundational, again, to language development, and this is actually across spoken and sign languages. And really, it's about forming larger units from smaller units of meaning, right? And then being able to keep doing that hierarchically till you have connected, words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs, and connected ideas, right? And it's only when you can do morphosyntax kind of fluently that you can actually comprehend what you're reading, because you're connecting all of those elements together. And again, there is sort of research on the social sort of effects of being able to communicate and understand and produce complex syntax enables sort of better social relationships, school readiness, and various life skills and educational outcomes. And interestingly, morphosyntactic disruptions specifically occur in, for example, developmental language disorder. And so that's a key sort of domain where, again, we're interested when we think about musicality in service of speech language disorders. And so here is actually where we found the least studies. And so we hope that there's going to be more activity in this area in the future, but we did find, and all of these studies were in children. So 3 to 17 was sort of represented. And we did find, all of these different results across expressive grammar, where, again, it was mostly rhythm, which was related. So rhythmic discrimination related with expressive grammar. And the figure on the right, which is from our lab, shows that this is over and above the role of prosody perception, as well as working memory and controlling for nonverbal IQ. So really getting that direct relationship. And the figure on the right had a smaller sample size, but figure on the left had a smaller sample size, but this whole thing was sort of looked at again in the Nitin paper on the right, where they had over 100 kids. And then we also see receptive grammar with a relationship. And interestingly, in this paper, they found a relationship between receptive grammar and musical ability, but not with musical training. And so that, again, is sort of thinking about, shared genetic architecture instead of neuroplasticity. And then we also looked at the study from my colleagues showing, again, both across simple and complex rhythm discrimination, the relationship with complex syntax. So that's just to kind of give you a picture of, there are many studies that we reviewed. So I do encourage you to sort of look through the paper, and it's divided up so that if you're just interested in one particular domain, you can go straight there and you can you can look at what the synthesis is for just that. Now, for me, the most exciting part, and the part that's going to take up basically my postdoc, is testing the Maple framework that we've set up here. And so I want to orient you to this slide a little bit so that we can get into the specific predictions. So on both sides, on the edges, you have sort of like the brain and the genes. So here we're keeping musicality variables on the left and speech language variables on the right. And essentially what I'm trying to show here is that we already have some genome-wide association studies, which are essentially studies that show you all of the different genes and all of the different SNPs that are associated with a trait, right? So that's kind of getting into the basic fundamental question of like, what is the genetic architecture, right? So here on the left, we have the beat synchronization GWAS, which is one musicality GWAS, right? And hopefully there will be many more in the future. So from these GWAS, like let's say the one on the left, you can derive polygenic scores for each person that you want to, even in an independent sample, as long as you have their genetic data. So as long as you have, let's say, a saliva collection, you can compute polygenic scores for them. And polygenic scores, in short, is basically like it's like a quantitative variable of someone's genetic predisposition for the trait that has been looked at in a GWAS study. So let's say we have a beat synchronization GWAS, which we do. We can now compute polygenic scores for everyone, like let's say who comes in for a new study in our lab, as long as we collect their saliva and have it genotyped. So that gives us a lot of flexibility and power going forward to kind of have a variable in our models that, apart from telling us just how they performed on our tasks, they can also tell us their sort of, like a score for their genetic predisposition. And so we would combine, the ideal thing is to combine that with the phenotypic data to do a number of interesting things. And then on the right side, I've just shown you the parallel of that. So I'm just going to take you through some of the predictions. So one of the predictions is that from these well-powered GWAS, which have over 20,000 people in these studies, it can be 100,000, 600,000. Once we have these GWAS, we can look at genetic correlations directly between these the traits that have been GWAS, right? So let's say we look at the genetic correlation between beat synchronization and a specific reading trait from the reading and language GWAS that was recently preprinted. So our prediction is that these will be genetically correlated. Similarly, our prediction is also that across traits, the genetic polygenic scores for, let's say, a musicality trait like beat synchronization will predict the phenotypic performance on speech, language, and reading tasks, right? So that is something that we plan to test pretty soon. And similarly, the polygenic scores for, let's say, reading skills we predict that they will predict the phenotypic results when it comes to testing people's musical rhythm discrimination skills in the lab. So it's kind of combining across. And of course, one question that usually comes up here is that, we first have to establish, which we plan to, that the polygenic scores for a trait actually predict the phenotype in that trait. So we're also kind of doing that in parallel. And then we can look at these cross-trait associations. And then we have many other predictions, but the last one that I'll talk to you about is the idea of the mediating neural endophenotype, right? So going from the sort of genetic architecture of, so let's look at the red line. So the genetic architecture of musicality, and, kind of going, like, how does it influence the phenotype of language, right? It might be through certain neural mechanisms that we already know are associated with language, right? So we can actually test this genetically as well by looking at like genome-wide association studies of specific brain structure, function, and development. So we think that when we introduce, let's say, polygenic scores for, associated with, let's say, some kind of developmental outcome for Broca's area, right? We might include that in a model. So what I really sort of want to leave you with is that you can leverage all of the same strategies that we've been using for all of our psychological models, where you sort of think carefully about the variables that you think are going to be strong predictors, and you can start including these genetic variables to get a more robust sense of those gene environment sort of contributions, as well as genotype phenotype sort of contributions. And there are some other like really cool things we can do with enrichment analysis, for example. So once we have the genetic architecture, once we have a sense of the genetic architecture of like, let's say, beat synchronization, we can look to see if those if the genes associated and the SNPs associated with beat synchronization are enriched for, or whether they overrepresent the genes that we know are associated with commonly correlated neural development, structure, and function, which are commonly correlated with language, right? So again, what we're trying to test is the genetic pleiotropy between musicality and language. So we can do that in many different ways using these cross-trait analyses. And so a lot of our work going forward is going to be like computational genomic strategies to get to the bottom of this left side of the framework of like, if we buy this premise, then like all of these other things can be tested as well. So first we need to establish the premise of that genetic pleiotropy. So yeah, I don't know if these arrows were helpful, but they helped me think about all the things we're trying to do when I was first learning this stuff. Okay. And then I'm just going to leave you with sort of our overarching vision. So on the left, we want to do all of these different big picture goals, right? We want to validate the phenotypic correlations in really large samples. And so, because if we're thinking from an individual differences perspective, we really want to capture as much variability as possible. We also want to dig deep and discover the fundamental genetic architecture of various traits. So we have some for certain reading traits and for beat synchronization, but there are many more traits that we can examine. I know my time is running out, so I'll just leave you with this slide where we hope that many people can join us in testing these predictions. And we think that there will be many benefits of doing so. And we can talk more about that in follow-up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Srishti. I think we leave the slide on so that people can read. It's a massive program that you have ahead of you, and we are super much looking forward. I'm particularly looking forward to the connection with the brain, because the brain, I think, is the mediator of all these things. Let me look briefly into the chat. What's happening? Okay. Sonia says hi, and sorry that she has to leave, but she will be around tomorrow, and says it's exciting work. And now the claps are coming in. Excellent. Maybe in the meantime, while people are thinking about their question, I can ask a question, Srishti.
Yeah.
So you have this wonderful, these two maple leaves that are overlapping with the pleiotropy, and say that's the genes that are kind of responsible for both musicality and language. And I'm wondering, how can we tease apart or be sure that these are language and music specific genes, or whether these are more general, domain general genes, like that control auditory working, memory, attention.
Right.
How can we tease these things apart?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And actually, since we're on this slide, I'll direct you to point number 4 in the sort of boxes, where I say this can sort of help us think about cognitive science debates about domain generality and specificity. And so, just like we're thinking about the pleiotropy between musicality and language, we know from human genetics that actually many cognitive traits are super pleiotropic with each other. So we actually don't even necessarily need it to be musicality specific and language specific for the sort of framework to still be relevant, because part of what the framework allows us to do is, if we find really high pleiotropy between, let's say, musicality genes and something in the brain, or even something in brain development, or even something in, like you said, auditory function or processing, then that kind of expands our sort of view of, what is actually going on with music cognition in the first place, from a biological perspective, right? So we're certainly not committed to the idea that it has to be specific to musicality, those genetic influences, because we actually do think it's going to overlap with many other cognitive things and many other biological things. And we're really excited to find out, once we start doing, and we've already sort of started, once we see where that leads us, it's going to change some of the framing of the phenotypes as well, perhaps.
I fully agree. Thank you. I now have a question from Henk-Jan Honing. Thank you, Henk-Jan, for this question. I put it in the chat for you, Srishti, and I read it out loud. So Henk-Jan is asking, what could or should music cognition researchers do to contribute to this fascinating line of research? Is more precisely defining musicality phenotypes important, or are rather crude ones like, can you clap to the beat of the music enough? That's a very good point.
I really appreciate this question, and again, it's kind of my first point, on the right side of this slide, where I really think we all think this is going to be a huge collaborative team effort of everyone trying to sort of contribute different parts that they can. But the question about sort of, can you clap to a beat? So this is really a question about deep phenotyping versus shallow phenotyping, and they have pros and cons. So one of the important things we need to do, and one of our goals, is to sort of really start validating shallow phenotypes that we think are good enough, and really look at the psychometric sort of results. And we've started doing that for a shallow phenotype of a semi-shallow phenotype, like of prosody perception, for example, but we can do that for various musicality traits, and really start looking at whether we can trust those variables. But you would be surprised at how powerful these shallow phenotypes are. And it is ultimately a trade-off between the scale that you're going for genetic studies, where you really need like thousands and thousands of people, but they can be validated in independent samples that have then been deeply phenotyped, where you can say, okay, but are these polygenic scores, or are these sort of genetic results correlating with our deeper phenotypes, and are we seeing the same pattern with the shallow phenotype? And that will give us more certainty about those as we go forward. But it's a process.
Wonderful. Thank you, Srishti.